Hi everybody, and today we're going to be talking about criminal psychology. We're going to be looking at the myths associated with it. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't truth to criminal psychology, which we will get into around the end of the video, because there definitely is. However, I think there are a lot of myths that are also associated with that people don't know are not actually the case. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and I thought this would be a good video because interest in psychology and criminal psychology has been increasing drastically over the last 10 years because of shows like Criminal Minds, Dexter, Mindhunter, You, and any other police or crime related TV show or entertainment. And yes, criminal psychology is something that entertains us, intrigues us, glues us to our TVs, but does criminal profiling actually lead to catching criminals? And are serial killers all mentally deranged, middle-aged men living with their mothers? And that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at the myths that are associated with criminal psychology in hopes to begin to differentiate what is real and what is dramatized on our television screens. And before we get right on into it, I do have to warn you that this will most likely be a two-part series, with today looking at a definition of criminal psychology, what it is and what it isn't, and then going right into the myths, some of which we will cover today and some of which we will cover next week. And if that sounds interesting to you, sit back, relax, enjoy, and let's get right on into it. Alright, let's jump into the criminal psychology definition. Now, criminal psychology is often described at looking at the motives, intentions, actions, responses of criminals pertaining to their criminal acts. And so we'll be looking at why people become criminals, why criminals continue to reoffend, and all of this is in hopes that if we can understand why somebody did something, we can hopefully predict when it will happen again and therefore prevent it from happening in the first place. And so just like psychology as a whole, we're looking at being able to control behavior by understanding it. And the difference here is that we're looking at a specific population, we're looking at a specific group of people, that being criminals. And now, contrary to belief, criminal psychologists are not just interested in serial killers, the worst of the bad. They are looking at every type of crime, whether that be petty theft or drug use, selling drugs, anything like that is probably going to be the main focus of criminal psychologists, just because serial killers, murderers are not as common as the internet, as television shows, entertainment makes it seem. And criminal psychology also isn't only about catching the bad guys. Sometimes it's about deciding which criminals are going to go on to reoffend and which ones are going to, leave jail and act as everybody else does, follow the laws and not hurt other people. And in the crime community, this is called recidivism, or essentially which criminals are more likely to reoffend. And as I had mentioned, this is often the job of forensic psychologists or criminal psychologists to look at the criminal population and decide who can get off early because they think they are not likely to commit another crime. And now this job has huge implications for two different reasons. One being that you don't want to keep somebody in jail who is no longer a threat to society. There are lots of criminals who need to be in prison and some who don't, and so it's sometimes a cost-saving thing to release the prisoners who are no longer a threat. And this is because more often than not, criminals are people that have been dealt the wrong cards in life, and that if given the proper support and encouragement can actually be law-abiding citizens who can actually really benefit society. However, they can't do that when in prison. And on the other side of the spectrum, you definitely don't want to release somebody who will go on to reoffend and who may potentially hurt other innocent people. So, one of the big jobs of forensic psychologists is actually making those decisions, whether that be through interviewing people, looking at statistics, and really figuring out who is still a risk to society and who is free to go a little bit early off of their sentence. Finally, criminal psychologists can also be seeing criminals in a therapeutic sense, trying to get them ready to re-enter and reintegrate with society, because often people who have committed crimes and have gone to jail for such crimes will unfortunately always be seen as a criminal, even if it was something as small as petty theft or drug use. And reintegrating into society can be very difficult, which can lead to isolation, which unfortunately can lead to reoffending because they don't have that support system that we as humans desperately need. And so sometimes it is the job of the forensic psychologists to really make sure they're ready to be released, whether that be through cognitive behavioral therapy of just, getting the person prepped and ready emotionally for that transition, or also just life skills training in preparing these individuals to re-enter the workforce that they may have been away from for a prolonged period of time. All right, let's get into the myths of criminal psychology, the bulk of this video and the next video, if it does continue into a two-part series. And TV shows have lied to us. That is the gist of what I'm going to be talking about now. Criminal psychology isn't as romantic as it often seems, and the research doesn't back up what we see on TV. We're going to be talking about 3 different areas of criminal psychology that are not backed up by research either at all or as much as they should be given its use in both TV shows and unfortunately in real life. First, we're going to be talking about criminal typing, then we're going to be talking about psychoanalysis, and finally we're going to be talking about criminal profiling. First, we're going to be talking about criminal typing and specifically looking at a gentleman by the name of Lombroso and his obsession with skull anatomy. Cesare Lombroso is often described as the father of criminology, and he developed the now debunked born criminal theory. And this suggests that you can tell who's going to be a criminal just by the facial features that they possess. And I think very clearly we can already see that there will be a problem with this one with stereotyping, and we will get into that further. And I also want to be very clear that this has been debunked. This is not fact. There is absolutely no research that suggests that Lombroso was right, even slightly, on this born criminal theory. I also apologize that people have once thought this way because it is not good. It is not something we want to condone even a little bit. And now, just for some background, this theory was developed in the late 1800s, so I think you can tell what the world was like back then, and that Lombroso was not any different than society, unfortunately. And his theory is predominantly based on racist ideas. And it came about when Lombroso was examining the skull of one criminal and tended to note that it looked different than the other skulls of non-criminals that he had been examining. And more specifically, he noted that the skull was more similar to that of an ape than that of the other skulls he had seen. And he made the subsequent conclusion, of which I will be reading a quote, and please know these are not my words, they are of Lombroso's, and you'll see why I do not want to claim them even a little bit right now. At the sight of the skull, I seem to see, all of a sudden, the problem of the nature of the criminal, an atavistic being who reproduces in his person the ferocious instincts of primitive humanity and the inferior animals. And then he goes on to say, thus were explained anatomically the enormous jaws, high cheekbones found in criminals, savages, and apes. Okay, so although Lombroso's views were supported at the time, there is nobody in their right mind that supports him today. I think it is very clear that he is relying on racist stereotypes that are not based in science or fact, but rather just the ramblings of an ignorant and rather delusional racist man. And now we're going to be looking at probably one of the most famous cases of criminal profiling ever, and specifically looking at the psychoanalysis conducted by Dr. Brussel in his contribution to the arrest of who was known as the Mad Bomber. The Mad Bomber, who was originally known as FP terrorized New York City for 16 years as he placed 33 bombs throughout the city in public places. Fortunately, no one actually died from these explosions. However, 15 people were injured. And over all of that time, over the 16 years of this investigation, there were no leads. Police had absolutely no idea who this FP character was and had no idea of how to find him. And all they had to go on were the letters that FP had written to various newspapers within the city. And this is when psychiatrist James A. Brussel was called to the scene. He was called in the hopes that he could analyze the letters written by FP to develop some sort of idea of who this person could be and various characteristics of his identity. Hence, the first case of criminal profiling. However, Brussel did not call this criminal profiling. Instead, he called it reverse psychology. And so Brussel studied those letters that FP had written and really tried his best to come up with some sort of identity or a criminal profile for the Mad Bomber. And Brussel concluded that the Mad Bomber was the following. First, he concluded that he was a textbook paranoid schizophrenic. Next, he decided that he was symmetrically built, neither fat nor too skinny, which I think is very interesting. I don't know how you could find that from a letter, but you know, I'm not a criminal profiler. He also felt that whoever this Mad Bomber was felt the need to convey his superiority. And now this individual would be educated, but not highly educated, probably a high school graduate, probably a skilled mechanic. And now I do have to note that these bombs, they were handmade, so I don't know if this is quite a jump. He decided that the Mad Bomber would be a neat, quiet, polite, methodical, clean-shaven man, and that he would have an Oedipus complex, or an Oedipus complex, however you like to pronounce that word, which is a Freud term. He believed that whoever this Mad Bomber was once in love with his mother and was sexually aroused by her presence as a child and wished to murder his father to step into his place and sexually be with his mother. And further, this is what he believed perhaps led him to criminal behavior. He also concluded that this man, i.e. the Mad Bomber, was not American by birth, but was instead from either Middle or Eastern Europe, and specifically he decided that he was Catholic and a Catholic Slav, so from the Slavic regions of the world. And his reasoning for this was simply that bombs were favored in Middle Europe. And now one of his most famous predictions, Brussel concluded that the Mad Bomber must live with female relatives who reminded him of his mother because he drew his W's with rounded points, more like two U's than the traditional way of writing a W, and that is because it resembles female organs, which somehow means that he must live with women. And perhaps one of the reasons this case is so famous, Brussel concluded that when police arrested the Mad Bomber, he would be wearing a double-breasted suit, buttoned. Now, was James A. Brussel right? Well, you'll just have to wait till part 2 to figure that out. And I'm sorry, I know that's awful. This video is just getting quite long and I do have a lot more to cover in part 2. Come back next week, find out if Brussel was right with the Mad Bomber case, whether or not the Mad Bomber, the true FP, was actually wearing a double-breasted suit, buttoned, when he was arrested. Stay safe and stay happy, and I hope to see you next week as we finish up this video on the myths of criminal profiling. See you then.